Bible support same-sex marriage? Duh. You know that answer, but the answer is just the beginning. Let's talk about it with Preston Sprinkle on Steve Brown, etc.
He's an old white guy, an author, broadcaster, and seminary professor who's sick of religion. And he's brought friends. Please welcome Steve Brown, etc.
Hey, we're so glad you're here, and you always have a place at our table. I know you're tired of me saying it. Frankly, I'm kind of tired of saying it myself, but I mean it. It's authentic, and it's true. So we are so glad that you're here. If you're wondering, I'm Steve, the aforementioned old white guy. Matthew Porter, our executive producer, is here. Matthew, the school year has now begun, and you have a high schooler. How do you feel about that?
Feel old. I feel old, Steve.
That's because you're old.
I was supposed to be a rock star astronaut stuntman by now. I don't know what happened.
Yeah, but there's an upside to having a teenager in the house.
Yes.
If you should die,
Yeah.
the Bible says you go immediately to heaven, and they don't even ask about Jesus.
All right. All right.
They say, you poor dear, you come on in. Our producer, Jinx, is in the little glass booth. Jinx kids are older than yours, Matthew. And he's well-adjusted.
I have much to learn from Jinx.
Just wait till you can turn them into Uber drivers.
Our one-man IT department, John Myers, is in the tech bunker. John's kids have also started school again. There were tears and some cries of "this isn't fair." But eventually, John calmed down and got over it. And Dr. George Bingham is the president of Key Life. And just so you know, he earned his doctorate while serving as our president. Exactly what position are you angling for, George?
Are you hearing footsteps?
Yeah, and it's kind of scary. And Kathy White, of course, is the soft feminine side of the program. Speaking of school, Kathy, are you ever going back to baking school?
Oh, no.
To teach.
Oh, no.
Not to learn.
No. There are those that are far better than I.
Not many, and I have never discovered one.
I've never met him.
No, so we have a great guest. In fact, this guest is the only one. When we finished our first interview with him, it was not enough to even touch the subject, and we invited him back. And he came back. Some of our guests refused to come back, but Preston not only was invited, he came. He's a biblical scholar, speaker, podcaster, and New York Times best-selling author. He's also the co-founder and president of the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender. He earned a Ph.D. in New Testament from Aberdeen University in Scotland. He's taught theology at Cedarville University, Nottingham University, Eternity Bible College. He also hosts the Theology in the Raw. He does that podcast, buck naked.
Oh, no, that's not what that means.
Can't unsee that.
And his,
No, it's not. I wear a shirt.
Donald Duckett.
his latest book, which I hold in my nicotine-stained fingers, is titled, "Does the Bible Support Same-Sex Marriage? 21 Conversations from a Historically Christian View." First question, Preston, are you crazy? I mean, you did the transgendered thing. You light the fire and the hatred and the hostility that you generate in people. There's something weird about you. This is such... I was telling Preston I'm working on a book, and I was reading his book this morning, and ended up quoting from his book in my book. And I told him that I expected a percentage of the books that he wrote that I sold. And I said there won't be many. The only people read them were my brother and mother, and they're both dead, so it won't cost him much. This is such a good book. What got you started on this?
Oh man, this book is, I mean, I've been in the conversation almost full time for over a decade now. And so this book is kind of like a collection of my responses to the top 21 kind of, pushbacks I often get, specifically pushbacks regarding a traditional theology of marriage, which is not the entirety of the conversation. I think there's a lot of relational and pastoral questions that, we should wrestle with. And I've done that in other books, but this book specifically is, whenever I go speak somewhere and there's a Q&A, everybody's like, what about this? What about that? And they throw all these questions my way. And so this book is kind of a one-stop shop summary of my responses to the top 21 questions that I've gotten over the years.
I think the book is incredibly timely. There's probably no subject, well, there are probably some, but not many subjects that stir up the fire in believers than this particular subject. As some of you know, Tony Campolo is my friend. We did a television program for a year where he was my wacko commie friend, and I was his right-wing redneck friend, and we debated all kinds of subjects. We were going to debate here in Orlando, and it had been set up for a couple of years. And we love each other. And he came out after being against it for a lot of years for same-sex marriage. And evidently, the hatred he received was unbelievable. And he called me, and he said, Steve, I love you. And if you don't feel that you can do this debate with me, I'll understand. And I said to him, Tony, this is just another one of your wacko views. You're my friend, and I love you. I don't agree with anything that you say except Jesus. And he got emotional. It was really a hard time for him. By the way, say a prayer for Tony. He's going through some really rough stuff. Had a stroke, and he and Peggy have been walking in some dark places. So if you think of it, say it. But at any rate, what I was saying was he was really hurt by the anger that had been directed to him. Yeah. What you have a problem with that too, and I loved your first chapter on that subject. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, the first chapter, honestly, is probably my favorite because I think it's applicable to so many relevant areas in the Christian church right now. It's how do we even have a profitable conversation, especially across contentious issues. And I feel like society as a whole doesn't have a clue how to do that. The church has the resources to be able to do that well. We've got much in our theological backpack, so to speak, to be able to have good, healthy, humanizing conversations across, diverse perspectives. And yeah, we're not doing it well either. So yeah, that first chapter, it talks about things like, how can we humanize somebody even across significant disagreements? Can we genuinely listen, like curiously listen to somebody else's perspective, even if we find that we just absolutely don't agree with it? Can we still be curious, ask curious questions about it? And some people are like, no, I can't do that. That's giving too much, we're giving in too much if we're curious about somebody else's viewpoint.
Right.
My response to that is, what makes you think they're going to be curious about your viewpoint? If you're not curious about that, it's kind of golden rule of conversation 101, but for some reason we kind of throw that out the window. So yeah, that first chapter is just all about how do we even begin to have these conversations in a way that's profitable.
You said that how we believe is as important as what we believe. And I believe that is so very important. And I don't always follow that rule. But every time I talk to you, I want to. Have you gotten, well, this book isn't out yet, or is it? We have a publisher's,
yeah.
It is out. Have you started getting some angry stuff?
Not yet. The feedback has been, I always hold my breath as authors do when a book's released. So far, the feedback has been much more positive than I had thought. Now, I can see across the online spaces and see that there's some pushbacks forming and stuff. So, which is fine. I invite people's critical feedback. I don't write a book to get everybody to agree, but to hopefully start again profitable conversations. So I'm sure those will come.
Why doesn't that surprise me? Of course, there was that one letter when she told you she was praying for your death and had been successful on 2 previous occasions. You really do welcome critiques that are honest and authentic, and you're in your face. And we're going to find out why. I think it's booze, but we'll see on the other side of the break. Hey, you really got to get this book. I mean, this thing is such a hot issue. So much damage and division is taking place in the church. And if you're a pagan, don't bother. But if you're a Christian, because we got to do it right, it's called Does the Bible Support Same-Sex Marriage? 21 Conversations from a Historical Christian View. This is hard. So we got to rest, but we're coming back. So glad that you're with us. Thanks. We're talking to best-selling author Preston Sprinkle, and his new book is called Does the Bible Support Same-Sex Marriage? 21 Conversations from a Historically Christian View.
Preston, I know we want to dive into some of the specifics of what you cover in the book of what the Bible actually says, but before we go on there, I just wanted to drill in a little bit deeper into the first chapter, because what you had conveyed is something I think we've all experienced, where we're really quick on the trigger a lot of times to have the right answer and express it well, and that's just gonna mic drop. We're done. We've got it.
Yeah.
And this relates a little bit, I think, Steve, to Talk the Walk, where you're like, look, you can have the right answers, the right theology, but if you're missing the love, if you're missing the compassion, the empathy, you just miss the whole thing. And this idea where people conflate understanding with agreement when they're not the same, and you can have a deeper understanding from somebody's perspective without conceding anything. So I think what I like most about you is you really get in the trenches with people, like eyeball to eyeball. So I'm curious, the question is, when you encounter people and they think you're going to throw hands, you're just going to, intellectually just have this free-for-all brawl, and you're like, nah, look, let me tell you what here's the truth, undiluted, but here's also Christ's love, undiluted. How does that land with people? Do you see surprise in their eyes? What reactions do you get?
Good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say that the responses are mixed, but I think it's typically more one of a little bit shock and surprise. I think it's pretty rare that people experience somebody who's genuinely, like deep down, genuinely interested in hearing their perspective. And so when they receive that kind of response from somebody who they assume is just going to attack them or blast them or argue against them, but this isn't just for anything, like if you stop and slow down and say, hey, I would really love to understand, where you're coming from, and you show genuine interest and curiosity like that's it has a disarming effect, and again, my motivation isn't, sinister. It's not like, oh, I'm just going to be kind so that I can really hit them with the truth. Like, it really is just an expression of how I think Jesus was. And really there's, one of the most fundamental statements in the Bible is that we are all created in God's image. We all reflect the beauty of the Creator. Like, that's a profound starting point. If you affirm that in the person sitting across from you and truly believe that, like, that's a starting place we should all have. So yeah, to answer your question, I think typically it's a bit disarming, and it does. It produces not agreement. This is what I want people to understand. There's no magic formula to like get people to agree with you, and I don't even know if that should always be the goal. But if we can both walk away having a better understanding of where someone's coming from, humanizing them and loving them even across disagreement, like, I think that alone can be a win as well. So
yeah. When you were on with us before, one of the things about you that was so clear is, when your ministry is built around the issues of sexuality, so many people have been hurt so deeply.
Yeah.
In so many ways, and you get that. And when you sit down and talk to those people, even if propositionally there's disagreement, your compassion and mercy and understanding of their anger goes a long way too, doesn't it?
I've heard so many, horror stories of people's experience in the church, from spiritual abuse, emotional abuse, physical, and even sexual abuse, And so oftentimes the depth of somebody's anger and aggression, for instance, some people look at, pride parades, or during June, you have all this kind of really loud, outspoken, gay pride themes and stuff. And rather than just reacting in kind and being, why are you so prideful that you shouldn't be, whatever, and you shouldn't be so angry, and why do you hate the church and all these things? Like, oftentimes there's some real deep stories that fuel somebody's, passion and aggression. So yeah, take the time to get to someone's story. You might be shocked, So
well, and yeah. I agree, boy, do I agree. But I'm not going to march in the parade on it. That's okay.
I think you look really good in some of those. Preston, I really appreciated the way you structured the book. I mean, you had a couple of foundational chapters, which I wanted to ask you, one of the foundational points to expand on. But and then you have a series of conversations, 21 conversation points, where people that sort of, let's say, don't hold a traditional view about same-sex marriage would make a point and have some genuine, even biblical basis for that. And you even indicate in a couple of those that you have held those positions before and gone through the process of kind of coming to a different perspective. But in particular, in one of the foundational points, you make the point just sex difference is an intrinsic part of what marriage is. And I wonder if you could kind of expand on that just as a foundational starting point.
That is the most important theological part of the so-called traditional view of marriage. What I see that so often happens in debates around same-sex relationships, same-sex marriage, is that people race to the 5 or 6 prohibition passages that say something negative about, same-sex sexual relationships. And then those passages are important, and I deal with a lot of those in the book. But the most fundamental question is, when we talk about same-sex marriage, opposite-sex marriage, traditional marriage, whatever, what's marriage? Like, when we use the term marriage, like, what is it we're even talking about? And so I do try to make the case that I think the best reading of Scripture from Genesis 1 and 2, Matthew 19, and other passages is that when the Bible talks about this thing called marriage, this one flesh covenant union, it necessitates sex difference. It is the union between a male and a female, and that is a necessary part of what marriage is and why God designed marriage in the first place. So if somebody's going to argue for same-sex marriage, and again, whenever I say argument, I want to make sure we're taking that first chapter with us as we even wrestle with this. But as we dialogue across these differences, I want to take us back to the heart of the question, and the main question is, what is this thing called marriage that we're even talking about?
Oh, so good and so true. A very bedrock of a culture is the nuclear family. And when you mess with that, you mess with a lot of, you have consequences that aren't planned that can be very difficult. That doesn't mean I'm against people having relationships, even formal ones, even legal ones. But you got to be careful when you start talking about marriage. Hey guys, this is so interesting and so important. You just can't turn off the dial or the screen. Stay with us or you'll get the fever and die. So glad you're here. We're hanging out with Preston Sprinkle. I should say Dr. Preston Sprinkle. Keep up with him at prestonsprinkle.com and on Twitter at Preston Sprinkle.
Preston, this is a moment of true confession here, and I don't know how to.
I don't know.
No, just be quiet. You don't know what I'm going to say.
Coughing and cussing.
A number of years ago in the church where Steve served, there was a young man who eventually came out that he was gay. Went through a lot, as a lot of gay people do during his life, and eventually, incredibly tragically, committed suicide. And as he moved on in age during that period of time, I saw in him, because he grew up in a Christian home, in the church, etc., I think in his mind, and I'm sure that he dealt with a lot. I don't want to minimize that at all, but I saw in him somewhat of what he felt like, there's no sense in talking to Christians because I already know what they're going to say. I already know what they're going to do. And so on those rare occasions when I did have an opportunity to talk with him, I wanted to say stuff like, I love you. That's not ever going to change. We may not agree on things, but et cetera. And that infamous statement that I think a lot of Christians say sometimes, which is, we're just going to have to agree to disagree. And when I started reading your book, lo and behold, I come to Conversation 20. It's an agree to disagree issue, and that's obviously not a great thing to say. And I'm glad now in retrospect that I never said it. But can you enlighten a little bit on that?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for sharing that. And, suicidality is a big part of this conversation. The rates among gay and lesbian, or especially trans identified people, is much higher than the general population. And there's it would take hours to kind of unpack the complexity of why that might be. There is no simple answer to why this person decides to take their life while somebody else in similar situations does not. So the chapters are framed in terms of stating the counter argument to a traditional view of marriage. This is one of the few chapters that isn't so much an argument for same-sex marriage or an argument against traditional marriage. It's more of people who kind of throw up their arms and say, well, this smart person says this other smart person says that. It's just unclear for whatever reason. God hasn't made this clear. So let's just, we debate the age of the earth, we debate rapture, whatever. And this is kind of one of those issues that's just a secondary issue in terms of church doctrine. Now, I'm very sympathetic to that perspective because I have people I very much respect who hold to same-sex marriage and will even give biblical arguments for why that is. I hold not just to traditional marriage, but I hold that very strongly too. This is something that when I talk about grace and love and kindness, sometimes people think, well, if you talk too much about grace, then you must not hold strongly to the truth. I'm like, I see that as a false dichotomy.
Yep.
In fact, this radical disruptive grace is part of the truth. So it's not a grace versus truth. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but anyway, I don't see the debate about same-sex marriage as simply a secondary issue like the timing of the rapture. I do think that the core essence of what marriage is, that sex difference is part of what marriage is, that all sexual relationships belong within that covenant bond. I do see this as clearly revealed in Scripture, and the historic global church has affirmed the basic definition of marriage for almost 2,000 years up until more recently. But so yeah, I think when the Bible does talk about matters related to sexual immorality, for instance, it says any sex outside of marriage, male-female marriage, as the Bible defines it, it is considered sexual immorality, and the Bible takes that very seriously, just like it does. It takes not caring for the poor seriously. It takes racism seriously. It takes other things very seriously. So this is not the only doctrine that I think we should treat very seriously, but it's one of several. So yeah, I don't think I don't agree with the perspective that would say, you know what, this is just kind of a secondary issue. We can just agree to disagree and not make a big deal out of it. I do think it is a significant disagreement that people have in the church.
Yeah.
I'll be interested, and we don't have time in this segment, but I'll be interested about why is this issue so big to people? Is there insecurity? And I'll let you think about that during the break. We do a question and answer, a lot of that with this ministry on our regular daily broadcast every Friday. It's Q&A. And surprisingly, one of the questions that we get as much as any other is, can gay and lesbian people be saved? And I just think, where are you coming from, man? I think you're too fat. But you may make it if there is God's grace. Of course they can. By the way, enough about that. I'm just talking. Does the Bible support same-sex marriage? Of course it does. Does that give you a reason to be a jerk? Of course it doesn't. And Preston Sprinkle is the best example, not of being a jerk, but being kind and compassionate and Christ-like. Don't you go anywhere. Thanks for joining us. By the way, if you haven't yet subscribed to the weekly Key Life email, it's encouraging, good, profound, based on grace. You're missing out. And the best thing is, if you don't like it, it's not free. It's free, and you can't complain. You can try it now by going to keylife.org/subscribe.
Preston, we were just ending that last segment talking about the question of, can somebody who has same-sex attraction, can somebody who's gay be saved? And I think that kind of in a roundabout way relates to one of your chapters, where there's one of the arguments is, well, the whole word homosexual did not even appear in the Bible until 1946. Your answer was not what I expected your answer to be. I wonder if you could address that and then connect back to that larger question.
That's a great question. And let me actually just clarify something I said before the break, that, I do, when I said this isn't just a secondary theological issue, there's a difference between something that's important for the architecture of Christian belief versus an individual believing those things to be like saved by God. For instance, is the Trinity important for Christianity? Well, yeah, it's one of the core theological doctrines. Well, if you were to survey the average Christian on the streets, how many would be articulate like a airtight Orthodox definition of the Trinity? Maybe like quarter. Most of them would probably be Docetist and all. It's spouting off all kinds of heretical things that would have gotten burned at the stake. A few hundred years ago. So I don't think the thief on the cross had a fully developed view of the Trinity, and yet he's still saved, right? So all that to say, I don't want to make a judgment call on someone's salvation. I think God's grace is so expansive and radical and surprising and unexpected. So by saying this is a very important doctrine, I'm not saying everyone who doesn't hold to the same view of that doctrine is therefore out. So just want to make that clarification. Yeah. So, and it's related to the point you brought up. So there is one of the 21 arguments that I deal with is that people say the word homosexual was added to the Bible beginning 1946, the Revised Standard Version, and other English translations since then use the word homosexual to translate, for instance, 1 Corinthians 6:9 that says, do you not know that, and I don't have it in front of me, the adulterers, the sexual immoral, the greedy, the slanderers, whatever. And then it says, some translations might say, and homosexuals will not inherit the kingdom of God. So the argument is that word is not a good translation. It shouldn't be in the Bible. And maybe my surprising response is I 100% agree.
But you say more than that.
Yeah. So the Greek word in that passage in 1 Corinthians 6:9, not that it matters for you to know the Greek word, but it's arsenokoites, and it basically means a man who is having sex with another male person. The word homosexual, as an English word, simply means somebody who is attracted to the same sex. In the same way, it doesn't say anything about whether or not they're acting on that attraction. In the same way, if I told you I was heterosexual, that says nothing about my sex life, as interesting or not interesting as that might be for you. It just means I am attracted to females and not males. So think about this. I've got several friends, and I know you guys do too, who are quote unquote homosexual. They are gay. They are attracted to the same sex, but out of allegiance to Jesus, they're committed to a life of celibacy. Or some might even be married to the opposite sex and be committed to that marriage because of, again, out of their allegiance to Christ. So, and yet they are quote unquote homosexual. They are attracted to the same sex. That is not what the Greek word arsenokoites means. It means somebody who is engaging in ongoing, unrepentant same-sex sexual behavior. So if my gay friends who are committed to celibacy will not inherit the kingdom of God because out of allegiance to Jesus, they're saying no to all sexual relationships, if that person doesn't make it in, then we're all kind of screwed, right? So that's where the word translating that verse, homosexuals will not make it in the kingdom. I'm like, that. Yes, I agree. That's a terrible translation. However, if we say, see, the Bible's been mistranslated here, and then if we say, therefore, the Bible doesn't, prohibit same-sex relationships, then I'm like, well, that therefore is, I think that's where the problem comes, not with pointing out that this is a bad translation.
You say in one of your chapters that one of the questions is that they didn't even know what homosexuality was. What do you say to that?
Well, it depends on what they mean by homosexuality. There was many people engaging in same-sex sexual relationships in the first century. It was widespread, widely known. I think some people say, well, yeah, but they didn't know about this thing we call sexual orientation, that some people have this innate, inborn, unchangeable desire for the same sex. My response is kind of twofold to that. It's, first of all, well, similar concepts did exist in the ancient world, and I pointed out in that chapter that we have evidence that no, people did have this idea that some people were just naturally wired for the same sex. And second of all, I don't know if the biblical authors would have changed what they said even if they did know about what we call sexual orientation, because biblical ethics doesn't say, well, if you have a strong, unchangeable desire for a certain act, then that means that act is morally okay. Like, that's just not the way biblical ethics works. It looks at the behavior, the action, and says, does that align with God's, design? Whatever desire we have for that action doesn't determine the morality of that action.
Good stuff.
But
So
but even with all this is where I try to remind us throughout all the chapters that if we forget God's scandalous grace woven throughout sexual ethics, then we are flying an airplane with one wing. We're missing a whole significant part of the gospel paradigm. And that's something that is often lost in these debates.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the area. And because that's your expertise, the place where you're ministering all the time, you know it's everywhere. And if you don't get grace, you can't talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're coming down to the end, aren't we? And I don't know whether we have enough time for this, but one of the points, and I guess one of the things that I really appreciated in your honesty with this arguments is you indicate in a couple of occasions that you found their argument very persuasive. And it was the conversation on Romans 1 is condemning excessive lust, not same-sex love. And I don't know if we have enough time for that, but
early in my journey, that argument, I'll just let the listener go and read that chapter to understand the argument. But I remember being really taken back, like, wow, I haven't thought about it like that. I was reading Romans 1. I'm like, wow, this seems to make sense. So I actually spent a lot of time doing a lot of in-depth research to figure out if that argument was legit. And at the end of the day, I showed where I think the argument is, and I think it's overplaying its hand, even though it makes some good points within it. But yeah, I point people to that chapter to understand the complexity of what I was addressing there.
Oh, Preston, I don't know where this hour went. Thank you. That happens every time you're on with us. And
Yet again.
Thank you so much for taking your time from a busy schedule. You guys, you got to get this book. We've just given you a taste of it, but it's a book that every Christian and every non-believer ought to read. Both will be surprised. Does the Bible support same-sex marriage? Preston, we rise up and call you blessed. Hope we can do it again.
Thanks for having me on, Steve. Really appreciate it.
Guys, we're going to come back and tell you who we're going to do it unto next week. What a great hour. We love Preston, and we love having him on. Matthew, give us that line. There was a Preston
he's so winsome and engaging in this issue of sexuality. I wish that we had a Preston sprinkle for every subject and every issue out there.
True. So true.
Yep.
You know, I'm probably the most opinionated person you've ever met. I mean, there is nothing about which I don't have an opinion. There is nothing for which I won't fight for the truth, that would be my opinion. And when I encounter somebody like Preston, I get angry at pride parades. I get upset with the talking heads and what they say, and because sometimes it's so contradictory to what I believe and the convictions that I hold. Now, I don't think that it is wrong. It's kind of like what he said about the word homosexual. I don't think it's wrong for me to have those convictions, to believe I'm right and they're wrong. Christians have to do that sometimes. It's who we are. But boy, does the Bible have a lot to say about how we approach the world. And we have approached with our sword and our gun and have said, you're going to hell if you don't agree with me, and I'm going to shoot this gun if you don't. And that's okay with some. With me, I talk good. I have a glib tongue. And so most of the arguments I get in, I can win. And I used to think it was a gift that God gave me, and I told him I really appreciated it. And he said, I didn't give it to you. That came from the other side. So Preston is good for the soul, and he's good for the church, and he's good for this particular subject. He doesn't compromise one bit. He's solid as a rock. But he smells like Jesus. And I think it wouldn't hurt for us to ask Jesus to do that for us. Who's going to be on next week?
Next week, Craig Hefner is going to be with us. And I booked this interview because the title of it is Kierkegaard and the Changelessness of God. And I thought, this is good job security because Mr. Brown likes Kierkegaard. So, and we've already talked to him. It was a great interview.
Yeah, it really was. You don't want to miss that. And if you're not familiar with Kierkegaard and you've read Francis Schaeffer's comments, you ought to be here and you ought to listen or watch. And we hope you will. Same time, same place next week. Between now and then, don't do anything we wouldn't. And that gives you a wide, wide berth. I ain't doing it.
Keep up with the gluttony, we'll need a wide berth.
Clear. It's a good one.